On the night before Prague exploded, the city looked alive, but it was already trapped. The war in Europe was collapsing around it. Germany was losing everywhere, and yet in Prague, the men with guns still believed they had time to decide who would live, who would die, and who would escape. That illusion lasted only a few hours. By the first days of May 1945, the German Reich was already a corpse pretending to breathe. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. The surrender had been signed in the West. But in Bohemia, the machinery of occupation was still moving, and the men running it had not accepted the end. Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner still commanded a huge and disintegrating force, and he ruled it through terror. His officers knew the logic of the last days very well. If they stayed, the Soviets would take them. If they tried to flee, they might be shot as deserters. If they surrendered at the wrong moment, they might disappear into a system of revenge they had spent years helping create. So they kept moving, kept issuing orders, kept pretending that there was still a battlefield to win. Prague, meanwhile, had been waiting for this moment for 6 years. The Czech people had lived under occupation, humiliation, censorship, arrests, forced labor, executions, and the constant message that resistance was useless. That kind of pressure does not destroy a city all at once. It builds a kind of silent rage, one that survives in families, in rumors, in hidden radios, in the memory of those who were taken, and in the patience of those who remain. By May 1945, Prague was no longer a city that wanted to endure. It was a city ready to break. What made the situation so dangerous was that nobody needed a grand plan for the city to ignite. All it needed was a signal. And that signal came from the one place that still mattered more than any government building in the city: the radio. The Czech radio station was not just a broadcasting site, it was the nervous system of the uprising. Whoever controlled it could speak to the entire city in real time, bypassing the German occupation structure and turning scattered frustration into coordinated action. The people inside understood this. They knew the Germans understood it too. That is why they did not simply wait for a chance. They prepared for it. They removed signs, confused the guards, moved through the building with purpose, and waited for the exact moment when the city would need to hear that it was not alone anymore. When the call finally came, it was not poetic. It was not carefully phrased. It was urgent, raw, and immediate. Czechs, come to our help at once. That sentence changed the entire mood of Prague in a matter of minutes. People who had spent years being careful suddenly stopped being careful. Civilians came into the streets not because they thought they were safe, but because they understood they might never get another chance. Men who had never carried a rifle began carrying one. Women passed messages, moved wounded people, and helped organize barricades. Workers, students, policemen, and members of the resistance all joined into one confused but determined flood of action. German signs came down. Czech flags went up. Trams were dragged into roads. Furniture, cobblestones, carts, and rubble were thrown together into barriers that were not elegant, but were real. Prague was turning itself into a battlefield, one street at a time. This is what makes the first chapter of this story so strong. The uprising was not led by confidence. It was led by necessity. Nobody in Prague could afford to believe that help would arrive quickly. The city had to act on its own, and that created a tension that never really goes away. The people in the streets were brave, but they were also exposed. They had the moral advantage and the numerical energy, but they did not have the weapons needed to finish the fight on their own. That weakness mattered immediately. The Czech fighters were armed mostly with whatever they could seize, hide, or improvise. They had rifles, pistols, and some stolen weapons, but they lacked heavy artillery, proper anti-tank defense, and the kind of organized firepower that could stop armored units once they arrived. That meant the uprising had to win quickly or survive long enough for outside forces to change the balance. It was a gamble from the start, and the city knew it. The Germans reacted with the speed of men who understood that Prague was becoming a political as well as a military threat. If the city held out, it would become a symbol of German collapse. If it fell to the Czechs before the Soviets arrived, that would be an even greater humiliation. So reinforcements began moving in from different directions, not as a unified army with a clear future, but as a collection of armed formations trying to preserve one last line of control. The result was immediate chaos. Prague stopped feeling like a city and started feeling like a trap with no center. Gunfire came from windows, stairwells, basements, rooftops, and side streets. Some German units pushed forward with armor. Others tried to secure roads and communications. Czech fighters used barricades and local knowledge to slow them down. But the Germans had too much firepower to be stopped by courage alone. Every street had the potential to become a killing zone. Every intersection could be lost in minutes. Every building could suddenly become the place where the battle changed direction. What makes this opening even more powerful is that the people in Prague were fighting more than one enemy at the same time. They were fighting the Germans, yes, but they were also fighting time. They knew the Soviets were approaching, and that created a strange and brutal pressure. The uprising was not just about taking back the city, it was about deciding who would enter it first, who would claim the victory, and what kind of future would follow after the Germans were gone. That is why the first moments of the uprising feel so tense. It is not only the sound of rifles and the collapse of order, it is the feeling that history is moving faster than the people inside it can control. Prague is no longer waiting for permission to rise. It has already risen. But the price of that decision is going to be enormous, because the men holding the city are not surrendering their power politely, and the city itself is not ready to survive the answer they will give. By the end of that first day, the outcome was still undecided, but the shape of the battle was already clear. Prague had crossed the line from occupation into open war, and once that happened, there was no going back. The first hours of the Prague uprising revealed a brutal truth. Courage alone could start a revolt, but it could not hold a city against armored power. Once the call from the radio had spread through Prague, thousands of people came into the streets almost at once. It was not a carefully organized army moving by plan. It was a city that had finally lost patience with occupation and decided to fight back before fear had another chance to settle in. That reaction was powerful, but it was also fragile from the beginning. The Czech fighters and civilians who flooded into the streets had something the Germans underestimated completely. They understood the city better than the occupiers did. They knew the narrow roads, the side passages, the buildings with good sightlines, the courtyards, the basements, and the places where a barricade could slow a vehicle long enough to matter. They used that knowledge immediately. Trams were dragged across intersections. Cobblestones were torn out. Furniture, stones, wagons, and scraps of metal were piled into roadblocks. Within hours, Prague had become a maze of improvised defenses. But the Germans were not facing amateurs for long. Once the uprising became undeniable, the German command understood that this was no longer just a protest or a moment of unrest. It was a direct challenge to their control of Bohemia. That meant they would answer it with force. Reinforcements were ordered toward Prague from multiple directions, and the city suddenly found itself under pressure from units that were still trying to move, regroup, and regain control after weeks of collapse elsewhere in the war. The problem for the Germans was that Prague was not an open battlefield. It was a dense urban environment where every street could become a choke point and every house could hide a rifle. Czech fighters used this to their advantage from the start. They attacked isolated German positions, seized weapons, and cut off movement whenever they could. The uprising spread faster than the Germans expected because it was built on local action rather than a single command structure. People did not wait to be told what to do. They acted because the city had finally reached the point where doing nothing felt more dangerous than resistance. Even so, the weakness of the uprising became visible almost immediately. The defenders had enthusiasm, but they did not have enough heavy weapons to stop armored vehicles if those vehicles managed to force their way through the barricades. That meant every minute mattered. every delay mattered. The Czech side needed time, confusion, and pressure from outside the city to survive. If German armor reached the center in strength, the barricades alone would not be enough. That is what made the fighting so tense in the first full day. The streets of Prague were filled with people who were no longer passive, but they were not protected either. Shots came from windows, rooftops, stairwells, and cellars. Civilians tried to run supplies, carry messages, and move the wounded while the shooting spread through the city. Some blocks were held, others were lost, and then some were taken back again within hours. The battle did not move in a straight line. It surged, broke apart, and reformed in different places at once. For the people inside it, there was no clean front line. There was only the next sound of gunfire. The German response grew harsher as the city refused to submit. Their objective was no longer simply to restore order. It was to break the uprising before it could spread further, and before the Soviet advance could turn Prague into a political prize. That gave the fighting an especially desperate edge. The occupiers knew they were running out of time. The resistance knew time was the only thing they could use against them. So, the battle became a race between German firepower and Czech endurance. One of the most important details of this phase was the role of the radio. The original broadcast did not just start the uprising, it became its heartbeat. As long as the radio kept speaking, Prague could still feel connected to itself. That mattered, because the Germans understood the same thing. When they struck at the transmitter, they were not simply trying to silence a machine. They were trying to cut the nerve that held the uprising together. The attack damaged the station, but even that did not end the resistance. Czech technicians found a way to continue broadcasting from a new location, proving that the uprising was now larger than one building. That resilience changed the emotional balance of the battle. The Germans could destroy structures, but they could not easily destroy the fact that the city had chosen to resist. Every time the radio returned, it reminded people that the uprising was still alive. Every time the message went out, it gave the defenders another reason to hold on for one more hour. That was the real battlefield inside Prague. Not only streets and barricades, but morale. By the end of the first day and into the next, the situation had become more dangerous. German forces pushed harder. Armored units began appearing on the approaches to the city, and the barricades that had seemed strong in the morning now had to prove whether they could survive a real assault. The Czech fighters had shown that they could seize the initiative. Now they had to prove that they could survive the answer, and the answer from the Germans was clear. They were not going to leave Prague alone. They were going to crush it if they had to destroy the city street by street to do it. The next phase of the Prague uprising changed the battle from a sudden revolt into a fight for survival. What had begun as a citywide outburst of resistance was now colliding with the full force of German desperation, and that made everything more dangerous than before. By this point, the Germans understood that Prague was slipping away from them, but they still had enough strength to make the cost unbearable. They began pushing armored units and battle groups toward the city in an attempt to reopen control, crush the barricades, and stop the uprising before it could gain any more momentum. This was not a clean military counterattack. It was a desperate effort by collapsing forces to keep one important city from becoming a symbol of defeat. For the Czech defenders, the danger was obvious. Their barricades had worked well enough against isolated German movement, but they were never built to withstand sustained armor, artillery, and coordinated attacks. The people holding the streets now faced the exact problem they had feared from the beginning. Bravery could delay tanks, but it could not stop them forever. The resistance had energy, local knowledge, and a reason to fight. What it did not have was the heavy firepower needed to control the battle once the Germans brought in stronger units. That imbalance created enormous pressure inside the city. Every position had to hold longer than it seemed possible. Every street had to buy time. Every intersection became a test of endurance. The Germans advanced with the confidence of men who had already accepted that the war was lost, but who still wanted to leave Prague broken behind them. They were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting to decide how much destruction they could still cause on the way out. The most frightening part of this stage was that the violence no longer stayed within the categories of military targets and military objectives. Civilians were trapped in the middle of the fighting. Some had joined the uprising, others had only been dragged into it by geography, and many were trying to survive in buildings and streets that suddenly became battlegrounds. The Germans responded to resistance positions with overwhelming force, and the city began to pay for every hour it refused to surrender. At the same time, the uprising itself became more organized out of necessity. The improvisation of the first day had to harden into something more disciplined. Fighters were assigned to barricades, communication became more urgent. Certain buildings, intersections, and crossings grew in importance because the city had to hold the line in places that mattered most. The resistance had no luxury of choice anymore. It had to turn chaos into structure while under attack. This was also the point where the psychological side of the battle became just as important as the physical one. The Germans wanted to make the defenders feel isolated and doomed. The defenders wanted to prove that Prague was not a city that could be retaken by fear. That struggle mattered because the uprising depended on morale in a way a regular army does not. If people believed the city could hold, they would keep fighting. If they believed the city was already lost, the barricades would collapse from exhaustion before the Germans even reached them. The radio continued to matter for exactly that reason. The voices coming through the transmitter were more than information. They were proof that the city had not been silenced. Every broadcast told the fighters that the resistance still existed, that others were still holding, and that the battle had not yet been decided. That kind of communication can change the atmosphere of a city under siege. It turns fear into a shared burden instead of a private one. But the Germans were also adapting. They pressed harder against the outer districts, used armor to force openings, and searched for ways to fragment the Czech positions. What had started as a spontaneous uprising was now becoming a true siege. That shift mattered because a siege favors the side with more weapons, more mobility, and more ability to absorb losses. Prague had the advantage of defiance, but the Germans still had the tools to make the uprising bleed. This is where the story grows more intense than a simple account of resistance would suggest. The uprising was no longer just about whether Prague could be freed. It was about whether the city could remain itself long enough for history to change around it. If it collapsed too early, the Germans would escape with some control intact. If it held, the city could become a symbol of national survival. That pressure gave every street battle enormous significance. The Czech fighters knew that help might be coming, but they could not rely on it. So they fought like every hour mattered, because it did. They built new barricades, reinforced weak points, and held positions that seemed impossible to keep. The battle increasingly became one of exhaustion. The Germans were trying to break the uprising with force. The Czechs were trying to outlast them with determination. By now, Prague was no longer just a city under occupation. It was a city in open combat, surrounded by uncertainty, and filled with men who understood that surrender would not come easily or cleanly. The next phase of the battle would bring in a new and unexpected force, one that would change the balance again, but not in the way anyone expected. By the time the fourth phase of the battle began, Prague had already gone beyond the point of a normal uprising. The city was no longer just resisting occupation. It was fighting against collapse, against fear, and against the simple fact that the Germans were still strong enough to keep killing even after the war had already started ending everywhere else. That is what made this stage so dangerous. The Germans knew they were losing, but they were still armed, still mobile, and still willing to turn the city into a ruin if that was what it took to prevent a total Czech victory. The Czech defenders, on the other hand, had already proven that they could seize the streets and hold the spirit of the city, but they still lacked the force needed to stop German armor on their own. So the entire situation became a race against time, and time was the one thing Prague could not produce. Then came the unexpected force that changed everything: the Russian Liberation Army. This was one of the strangest and most dramatic turns in the entire battle. The men of the Russian Liberation Army were not fighting for Prague out of loyalty, and they were certainly not fighting for the Czech cause in any pure sense. They were former Soviet soldiers who had ended up in German service, men who had spent years trapped between regimes that both treated them as disposable. By the final days of the war, they understood exactly what capture by the Soviets would mean for them. For many of them, it was not a military defeat. It was a death sentence, or something close to it. That fear changed their behavior. When they saw the situation in Prague, they did not see a noble uprising to support. They saw an opportunity to break away from the Germans, gain leverage, and possibly improve their chances of reaching the Americans before the Soviets closed in. In a war already full of betrayals, this was one more betrayal folded into the end of a collapsing empire. And yet, in practical terms, their arrival mattered enormously. The Russian Liberation Army brought something the Czech resistance lacked completely: heavy weapons. Tanks, artillery, and anti-tank capability suddenly entered a battle that had been dominated by barricades and small arms. That did not make the city safe, but it made the German advance far less one-sided. For the first time, the defenders had access to firepower that could actually challenge armored assaults instead of merely delaying them. That shift changed the emotional atmosphere of the battle immediately. The Czech fighters, who had been holding on with improvised defenses and sheer willpower, now had another reason to believe that Prague might survive. The Germans, who had been expecting to crush the uprising before it became too dangerous, suddenly found themselves facing a more complicated battlefield than they had planned for. The city was no longer a simple target. It was becoming a trap. The arrival of the Russian Liberation Army also made the battle morally even more complex. Men in German uniforms were now fighting against other Germans, alongside Czechs who had spent years under occupation, in a city that was waiting for the Soviets to arrive. There were no clean loyalties left in Prague. There was only survival, revenge, and the desperate calculation of who might still live through the final collapse. On the streets, that meant the pressure began to shift. German units that had been pushing forward with confidence now had to deal with new resistance from an unexpected direction. The Czech barricades still mattered, but now they were supported by weapons that could seriously threaten the German approach routes. The Germans could no longer assume that every advance would succeed just because they had armor. That forced them to slow down, regroup, and spend more force than they wanted to. This was also the moment when the political meaning of the uprising became clearer. Prague was not just a city fighting occupiers. It was a city caught between collapsing German power, desperate local resistance, and the arrival of another force that did not fit neatly into either side of the conflict. Everyone was making decisions based on fear. The Germans feared surrender to the Soviets. The Russian Liberation Army feared the same thing. The Czechs feared that the city would be lost before liberation could be claimed. And beneath all of it, the Soviet armies were moving closer every hour. That pressure made every action feel temporary and unstable. No one in the battle could trust that the next hour would belong to the same side as the last one. A street could be held in the morning and lost in the afternoon. A barricade could become a victory or a death trap, depending on which armored unit appeared first. A local success could mean nothing if the larger front shifted elsewhere. Prague was turning into a place where the battlefield kept changing faster than the people inside it could fully understand. The Russian Liberation Army's involvement did not solve the battle. It did not create a decisive victory. But it bought time, and in this kind of war, time was everything. It slowed the German momentum, disrupted their assumptions, and gave the Czech resistance a brief but crucial advantage. That mattered because the uprising had always depended on survival, not perfection. It did not need to win every fight. It only needed to stay alive long enough for the wider collapse of Nazi Germany to catch up with the city. By now, the Germans were no longer fighting as if victory was possible. They were fighting to shape the terms of their retreat. That made them dangerous in a different way. A defeated army with no future can still destroy a great deal before it disappears. Prague was learning that lesson street by street. And just when the city seemed to be shifting toward a more balanced struggle, the real question emerged. Would the resistance, the Russian defectors, and the collapsing Germans all end up fighting for the same road west before the Soviets arrived? That was the new center of the battle, and it was about to decide who escaped, who was trapped, and who would pay for the final hours of the war in Prague. By the final days of the battle, Prague had become more than a city under attack. It had become a test of what was still left of Europe after 6 years of war, occupation, betrayal, and collapse. Every side in the fight was now moving for a different reason, but all of them were running out of time. The Germans in Prague were still trying to force a way west. For them, the war was no longer about victory, ideology, or even strategy. It was about survival. They knew what the Soviets would do if they were captured, especially if they were identified as SS, or as men who had helped carry out occupation and repression in the East. That fear made them dangerous. It also made them unstable. A force that has already accepted defeat can still kill people on the way out, and Prague was about to pay for that truth one last time. The Czech resistance had already done what many thought impossible. It had taken a city that had been occupied for years and turned it into an active battlefield against the occupiers. But now, the uprising faced its hardest question. What does victory mean when the enemy is still armed, the city is damaged, and the Soviets are almost there? Prague was no longer fighting only to win. It was fighting to survive the final hours without being erased in the process. The Russian Liberation Army, which had entered the battle for its own reasons, was also reaching the end of its road. These men understood that the war was ending and that their future depended on reaching the Americans before the Soviets closed the trap. That meant their presence in Prague was never really about loyalty to the Czech cause. It was about escaping a fate they believed would be even worse than death. They had joined the battle because it gave them leverage, not because they had found a cause. And once that leverage began to disappear, so did their commitment. That is what made the last phase so tense. Prague was no longer a simple fight between occupier and resistance. It had become a three-sided scramble, with each force trying to protect its own exit from the ruins of the war. The Germans wanted to get out. The Russian Liberation Army wanted to break away and survive. The Czechs wanted to hold the city until liberation became real. And the Soviets were already close enough to make every decision a matter of minutes. As the battle tightened, the emotional center of the city changed. The first days had been about uprising. Then they became about defense. Now they became about the cost of holding out long enough for the end to arrive. That cost was not abstract. Streets were burned, buildings were damaged, civilians were trapped between moving columns and collapsing lines. People who had risked everything to rise up were now facing the possibility that the final hours would still bring massacre instead of freedom. The Germans tried to break the remaining resistance and open the road west. That was the final logic of their movement. They could not win Prague, so they wanted to escape it. But escape was not simple anymore. The city had become clogged with barricades, ruined vehicles, armed civilians, local fighters, and foreign troops who no longer trusted one another. Every route out of Prague had become contested. Every delay increased the chance that Soviet forces would cut them off completely. The Czech side understood this clearly. They had no reason to make the Germans comfortable. Every minute the German columns were trapped inside or around Prague was a minute closer to the arrival of the Red Army and the end of the occupation. That is why the resistance kept pressure on the retreat routes, even when the larger battle was already slipping into chaos. They knew that if the Germans escaped in good order, they would be able to cause more harm elsewhere. If they were trapped, the war would finally close around them. Then, the Soviet forces arrived. Their entry into Prague did not feel like the triumphant ending one might imagine in a simple war story. It was more complicated than that. The city was already battered. The German presence was already fragmenting. The resistance had already paid a terrible price. The Soviets came in as the final force in a battle that had already been decided by exhaustion, fear, and the collapse of the German command structure. They finished the war in Prague, but they did not begin it, and they did not make it clean. That is one of the most important truths of this story. Prague was not saved by a single dramatic moment. It was saved by a chain of impossible decisions, desperate actions, and brutal timing. The uprising started because the city refused to wait any longer. It survived because the Germans could not move fast enough to destroy it before their own collapse caught up with them. And it ended because the larger war, which had already ended on paper, finally reached the streets in full force. When the fighting stopped, there was no clean sense of closure. There was relief, but also exhaustion. There was victory, but also destruction. There was freedom, but also the knowledge that it had arrived too late for many. Prague had lived through one of the strangest final battles of the Second World War. A battle fought after surrender had already been signed, by men who knew they had lost, in a city that chose to resist anyway. That is why the Prague uprising still matters. It was not just the last burst of violence before peace. It was proof that history does not always end when leaders say it does. Sometimes it ends only when ordinary people, trapped between collapsing empires, decide they will not wait to be erased.